Good morning, everybody. I am delighted to be hosting today's Pesca Pick. My name is Avanti Hawk, and I am a first-generation settler whose parents migrated from what we know today as Bangladesh. I grew up on Treaty 1 territory, which is the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Oji-Cree, Dene, Dakota, and Métis peoples in what is currently known as Winnipeg, Manitoba. I have the great pleasure of hosting our guest today, Professor Ranjan Datta, who is a Canada Research Chair at Mount Royal University, situated on Treaty 7 lands. And Professor Datta is going to be talking today about his own reconciliation and decolonization journey. And so some of the questions that he's going to be exploring include looking at how settlers can approach reconciliation, and again, examining who we are and where we come from. When we think about land, who owns these lands that we walk and live on? And what are the responsibilities for reconciliation in terms of social and environmental health resilience? This presentation is going to be looking at transdisciplinary questions that challenge not only our static science and social science mindsets, but also how can we as settlers take responsibility for reconciliation, including building respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples, respecting treaties, and also looking at how we can start to decolonize our own ways of knowing and being. And without any further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Ranjan. But sorry, before I do that, I'd like to take a moment to thank our ASL interpreters, Lily and Jillian, for doing the work of interpretation today. So take it away, Professor Datta.
Thank you so much, Avanti. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that having this opportunity is an opportunity to build a relationship, and also part of who I am and what I'm going to do. I would like to let you know that I'm not defining the meaning of reconciliation, but I'm just sharing my learning experience from my 12 years living in 36 territories. So in my presentation today, I'm going to talk about what are the cross-cultural meaning of decolonization and reconciliation, and how cross-cultural perspective of challenges and how to overcome those challenges from few of my case studies. Before I'm going to explain my story, just I would like to acknowledge that I have the opportunity to living in 36 territory and having the opportunity to learn and have the guidance from the indigenous elders, educators, and mentors. And I born in minority communities in Bangladesh, which is situated in South Asia, surrounded by India. And I have seen how minority and indigenous community have been struggling with their land rights, their water rights. So in my childhood, from my childhood, I have learning how the struggle of colonization is connected who we are and what we need to do. So, and I have the opportunity to work with the Cree, Dene, and other Métis communities in Saskatchewan last 10 years. Currently, I'm living in 37 territories in Calgary. And I had the opportunity to work with various indigenous communities and minority communities in back home Bangladesh. I have also opportunities to learn from some indigenous community, Finland and Norway. And currently, I'm also working with the Cree, Dene, and Métis. My mother tongue is Bangla, which is mainstream Bengali language in Bangladesh. Currently, I'm also learning from one of the elder first lesson language. It's very beginning, but I'm very fortunate to having this opportunity to learn, because language is one way to create the belongingness with this land as a colored settler here. So I have been working with my own communities and other indigenous communities in Bangladesh and here last 50 years. The meaning of reconciliation has various meanings. Today, I'm going to share some of the cross-cultural perspective on reconciliation. When I'm saying cross-cultural perspective, this includes many indigenous communities, color of indigenous communities, Black perspective. However, all this perspective is very limited with my own learning. There are many other learnings that I'm not talking to. So when we are talking about cross-cultural perspective of reconciliation, I have learned from my last 15 years working experience with indigenous communities. First, we need to know indigenous land rights, the land we are living. Because without knowing indigenous land rights, the meaning of reconciliation is not going to be applicable. So according to Elder and Knowledge Keeper, first we need to learn indigenous land rights, the land we are living. Second, we have to understand the decolonizing our ways of knowing and doing. Without decolonizing, it is not possible to reshape or create our own belongingness, the land we are living, the work we are doing. That's why decolonizing our ways of knowing and doing is a significant part of understanding reconciliation. Another part is very important to learn, respect, and honor indigenous ways of knowing and doing as a scientific knowledge. Indigenous elder and knowledge keeper, they are the scientists for the community. So we as a researcher, educator, or professional, we have to learn, we have to know that indigenous knowledge has been sustainable for thousands years. If they are sustainable for a long time, we have many responsibility to learning as a scientific knowledge in collaboration with Western knowledge. Another important factor I have learned from the Dene, Cree, and Métis communities here, that when we are talking as a color settler, as a researcher, educator, we have to learn what are the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls for actions are, and how we can practice those calls in our, not only for learning, how we can practice individually, collectively, and building the solidarity for the meaningful implication of TRC call for action. Another important factor that I learned from indigenous communities. Indigenous community, they are not denying Western meanings of science, Western meanings of doing or solving problem. However, they want to use the Western knowledge for solving their problem. So what is the problem now currently is going on? Indigenous knowledge is just using for the maintaining the colonial structure. That's why build indigenous community. Whenever we are talking about reconciliation, we need to understand, we need to create bridge between academics and communities needs. Last but not least important, we have to keep in mind that meaning of reconciliation from cross-cultural perspective, we have responsibility to be part of reclaiming, protect indigenous land, water, culture, and language. So these are the few perspectives that I have learned from my last 10 years in Canada, working with various indigenous communities, and many more years in my back home with my own indigenous communities and minority communities. So today I would like to also share some of the challenges as a color settler here I have learned as a community member, as a board member of the various settlement organization, and living as a researcher in the community. So some of the challenges that I have learned, I would like to share in forms of unlearning the challenges in reconciliation. The first problem is many indigenous, many immigrant and refugee communities. Being a settler, a color settler here, I have learned from my own community, that is Bangladeshi community here, that immigrant and refugee community they have many misconceptions about indigenous ways of life, ways of their traditional knowledge. Not only indigenous ways of life, they have also lots of misconception about immigrant and refugees ways of life. In the multicultural setting, we learn only 10%, and we think that we learn everything. The 90% we don't learn. That's why in multicultural society, through the various multicultural program, we compare that Bangladeshi immigrant is better than the Pakistani immigrant, or Pakistani immigrant is better than the Indian immigrant, or from the indigenous community. So the misconception about indigenous people, immigrant people, and refugee people is created a wrong assumption about who we are in this land and what we are doing. We see only outcomes, not see the impact of colonization. We, as an immigrant, we do not see the importance. Actually, we do not have opportunity to learn what is the importance of traditional knowledge and practice. What is the meanings of development that from the indigenous perspective? Indigenous community, they have been using concept of development for thousands of years. And they have different ways of understanding meanings of development in relation to living in collaborative. But our neuroscience, ways of looking through our Western education, only scientific-based solution created many misconceptions. And indigenous culture, refugee culture became tools of entitling tools in multicultural society without deep understanding. Another important challenges that I have learned in my own 10 years experience here is lots of immigrant, newcomer, even those who are living for 20 years here, immigrant communities, they have lack of knowledge or denial the colonial history of Canada. In my citizenship exam, Canadian citizenship exam, I had to learn how white has been fighting with other white to creating better society here. I didn't have opportunity to learn in what the indigenous people, what are the colonial history, and that's why many lack of knowledge or denial coming from the historical impact here, denying impact of residential school, and which has been created many other challenges. Promoting our own judgment from learning from other people, or promote settler colonialism. Oh, the colonization was good, residential was good, because we learned the residential school created many opportunities. So those are the misconceptions created among the new migrant and refugee communities that I have seen last 10 years. And also impact not only impact on the indigenous people here, how it's impacted indigenous land, water, and culture. Another important factor in multicultural society I have seen is there is a significant lack of learning opportunities. It's not enough institutional opportunity to learning about indigenous people, colonial history in the university, in the community, or in the other institutional support. So there is a significant lack of what is the anti-racist education, how anti-racist education and practice can help to build solidarity. We didn't have enough opportunity to know how, as a color settler, how we can create belongingness, how we should take responsibility as a color settler to the people, to the land and water, and why we need to building the bridge between our learning and practice, and lots of denial or lack of knowledge on everyday racism. Another important factor I have seen the understanding indigenous social justice movement. From 2010, 2011, I have been actively involved with I Don't Know movement, afterwards Standing Rock movement, and I have learned from my own immigrant communities why you are doing lots of indigenous rights movement, whereas you can do other stuff. So many immigrant and refugee communities, they don't understand how being part of the environmental social justice with indigenous people is actually not productive. It's for me, creating my own belongingness, knowing what is my rights, So indigenous, immigrant and refugee communities, they have many misconceptions about climate just movement, and many of we do not know how to speak up against racism. That's why we always think that if we work hard, we will be okay because we came here to contribute, not from the land. That's why we always justify internal racism among us that, oh, I'm not doing well because I'm not working hard, or just justifying racism with other communities, that I'm the better than the others. So comparison comes from the lacking of knowledge about indigenous people, culture, and indigenous social justice movement. And since I have been involved with various settlement organizations in Saskatoon, federally and provincially as a board member, I have seen there are significant lack of anti-racist staff in the settlement organization, and of course significant lack of indigenous staff as well. And most time when I was sitting in the board of director, I have seen 2 or 3 people are from the color or indigenous within 15 board members. So it became I became the showcase or tools of the structure, colonial structure has been going on for a long time. So they have the settlement organization, they have significant lack of knowledge on anti-racism education, anti-racism ways of doing, and of course there is a funding is a significant issue. And there is another challenge that I have seen, there is a significant lack of initiative, federal and provincial anti-racist initiative in the settlement organization. That's why the many immigrant and refugee community, even settler people, they don't know what to do, how to do. And we don't know what is our right and responsibilities, how we can create our belongings. What does the decolonization mean? How we can unlearn and relearn, and how this unlearning and relearning can help us. How to build a trustful relationship with indigenous communities, and how to speak up for racism for me and for others in the multicultural society. So I had many, as I said, I have many opportunities to learn from indigenous people, mentorship from the indigenous educators and scholars. And actually, what I have learned is the all contribution from the indigenous elder and knowledge keeper. So I have learned many misconceptions before I coming to CPD6 territory about indigenous people, but these indigenous people helped me to grow. So today I would like to share one of the case studies that I have been using last 8 years. In 2011, we started a community garden with 10 plots from 3 different countries. And in 2018, it became 120 community garden plot from 28 different countries with indigenous settler, black and color immigrant and refugee communities. And I use participatory action research in this case study. And I use indigenous elder and knowledge keeper story to learning about why, learning about native land, understanding meanings of land from indigenous perspective is important to who I am today as a color settler, how I can create my own belongingness. So I use music, art, dance as a method as well. I've also used blanket exercise as an important method, because blanket exercise gave us the opportunity to learning the colonial history from indigenous perspective, led by the indigenous elder, knowledge keeper or youth, and indigenous elder and knowledge keeper story sharing. Another method I use commonplace book to writing my own reflection, what I am learning and how I am practicing my learning through my everyday practice, such as in education, in research, teaching, even sharing with my own community. So during my learning, one of the elder say, land is not for human that we see in scientific sense. Land is for everything. So I requested this elder, what does it mean if you can elaborate? So elder asked a youth to draw a picture. What does the land mean to their youth? So one of the youth who is grade 10 years in grade 10, he draw a picture. The meanings of land is connect everything. It's human, birds, lake, caribou, trees, sun, moon, rock, everything. So when we are thinking about what is the meaning of land, what is the meaning of water, includes everything. We cannot separate one from each other. And meaning of reconciliation is we have to understand through decolonization lens. That means unlearning and relearning. Unlearning what has been challenges, what are the colonial history has been created for whom. And once we understand how the colonial history has been challenging for many, not only indigenous people, even with immigrant refugee communities, then we will have opportunity to relearn from indigenous perspective, create that common place for the not only for human, but also for the non-human. So in one of the indigenous Dene First Nation knowledge keeper was explaining to indigenous and immigrant youth that why we need to find out the fossil fuel. The indigenous youth and immigrant youth, they are finding the importance of fossil fuel, not only for understanding Western science, but also indigenous youth, they are explaining finding fossils, it will help to understand their ancestral relationship with their land, water, or the lake they are living, or the water they are drinking. So understanding the scientific science from the Western perspective, it was beneficial or created the belongingness with this land. So we have to understand what we learn of everything from indigenous perspective is relational. With our moon, rock, clay, whatever we learn. And learning is, since it's relational, it's once it's relational, makes us responsible to our relationship. And our responsibility to not only learning, we have responsibility to sharing what we have learned, how we are unlearning. And today is also opportunity to share what we are learning together. And I'm thankful again for this opportunity, sharing my own learning today with you, because you become relatives and responsible in this learning. An indigenous elder was explaining the meaning of reconciliation, learning the traditional knowledge, why it is important, why hunting, gathering, or the traditional ways of doing important for their life or for their for building sustainability for their future generation. And one of the 97 years elder, he said, I'm going to die soon. I'm going to die with many successful stories. And you as a researcher or color settler has responsibility to learn this knowledge and also share this knowledge to your own relative and the indigenous youth. So I feel this is all of our responsibility to learning the importance of indigenous knowledge and use in our practice. And this is another example is showing one of the indigenous knowledge keeper sharing the importance of traditional stories for the cross-cultural communities. So that cross-cultural community, they know why the native land, native ways of doing is important when we are doing community garden. Community garden is not just harvesting food and eat those, but also we have opportunity to create the cross-cultural world from the indigenous perspective. And as you can see in this picture, indigenous youth, they are teaching immigrant and refugee communities how the colonization have started and what are the impact of the colonization in indigenous communities and land and water. So through this community garden, we have opportunity to learning those stories through blanket exercise. And in our community garden, we don't do the community garden within the community space. We had opportunity to visit to the indigenous heritage place and indigenous elders. They are explaining the how we can be part of reclaiming indigenous land rights, indigenous knowledge practice, or indigenous water rights. How we can be part of this solidarity struggle. And indigenous, another photo they are showing is how relational practice is important when we are growing food, when we are eating, how it's interconnected with everything. So response for building relationship, what are our responsibilities, how we are practicing in our community garden. So children, according to indigenous elder and knowledge keeper stories, they had opportunity to create their relationship with the birds, butterfly, ladybugs, and worms, and many other things. They are learning informal ways of understanding what is the environment, how I am part of the non-human. As you can see, the children, they are learning their relational stories with their plant. Why plant is important in our human and non-human, how we can become responsible to the native plant or the insect, so that we can understand what we need to do. As you can see, another children, they are trying to understand what is the insect mean, and how we can use how we can learn the importance of the insect from indigenous perspective. And relationality is also celebration of the food that we are growing, how we become responsible the food we are eating, food we are growing, food we are creating the network through the foods. And children also learning why they need to grow the food, how they can create self-determination when they are learning about the food from the indigenous perspective, and why we need to take care about our environment, our land, our insect. So what are our responsibilities? So once we are learning from indigenous elder and knowledge keeper and youth, we also sharing our own future generation. And as you can see, children are learning why relational ways of working is important to create our own belongingness. And in our community garden, we didn't only created food. We trying to understand how music, art, or other forms of ways of doing are interconnected in our community garden. And it's also building sense of community, so that we are responsible to each other. We know the indigenous struggle is also our struggle. And we also need to create sense of community. In the cross-cultural children, they were learning the native plants and doing artworks in the community garden and learning the story from indigenous elder, but also they are learning the stories from their immigrant parents, grandparents, so that they can connect it. Not only just learning indigenous people, they can connect it. How their learning is interconnected with their own culture, so that they can understand how to create belonging in this land. And it's also celebration, the food that we are growing, and also connecting with each other, and also sharing the food is another way. And also creating community garden help us to create the network with the various immigrant communities, refugee communities, and indigenous communities, and also the local food bank, so that we know who don't have opportunity, they have opportunity to share the food we are growing. And children were drawing the importance of non-human, why bee is important for our own survival, why bee is important growing our own food. And as you can see, children were drawing the picture of butterfly, and not only drawing, they are drawing their artwork about the insect, they are also learning the stories from their own parents and also from indigenous elder and knowledge keepers. And this opportunity giving us also different opportunities to learning how we should create our responsibility to both human and non-human, from the childhood to young generation to the adult generation. As you can see, children are doing their own work and connecting with their learning. That's why we have learned from last 8 years that meaning of reconciliation, that we need to know that we are all treated. That means we are responsible to each other. We are responsible to the people of the land, culture, and also the ways of knowing. So when we are thinking about reconciliation, if we can summarize what is the meaning of reconciliation from the cross-cultural perspective, we need to know who we are, where we came from, and we also need to know who owns this land that we are living. And what does the reconciliation mean as an individual, as a family, as a community, and create our own solidarity within this community. And by the way, decolonization is not only learning, it can help us to create our own belongingness, self-determination, and empower us. And what are the indigenous history of the Canada? What the colonizer did with the indigenous people. Learning in the colonial history of Canada is helped me to understand what I need to do and what I can do as a personality, what we can do as a community, and how indigenous land-based education help us to achieve the social justice in meanings of reconciliation. And again, according to indigenous elder and knowledge keeper, what I have learned, the meaning of reconciliation is about indigenous land rights, is about TRC, call for action, indigenous self-determination and self-governance. Indigenous self-determination, understanding indigenous self-determination is help me to create my self-determination, how I can build trustful relationship with indigenous community. Indigenous, one of the important issue I have learned from my through life, indigenous knowledge has been sustainable for thousands of years. They don't need validation from the Western science that your knowledge is good. We know it's good, it's proven. So that's why we have to understand indigenous elder knowledge keepers is significant knowledge for their community, and we have opportunity to learn, and we have responsibility to protect indigenous language and border. We need to understand, respect, and creating space for indigenous knowledge system to create a collaboration or help and guide the Western knowledge. And we have to create interconnected consciousness that everything has importance, everything has a power. And we have to transform our research, not only our research, who we are as a researcher, to help the community, help us as a researcher. This can help to reshape, rethink our responsibility as a researcher. And of course, we have to advocate for funding for the community. So with the challenge that I have had talking, I have learned that we need to, as a researcher, from my position, I need to reshape, relearn from the community to bridging the community and scholar values, and understanding complexity from various perspectives. We know knowledge varies according to community, land to land, elder to elders. And all these perspectives are interconnected, and beauty of the knowledge. So another important, we have to understand in indigenous ways of knowing our worldview is not only one ways of knowing, it's thousands of ways of knowing. And all those ways of knowing important or interconnected with relationally. And all this knowledge is important for the community that we are working, or the profession that I'm working. And we have to understand that the work we are doing has to be community-based participation. It's not only one time we are going and doing work or one course we are doing. It's a lifelong journey of unlearning, relearning opportunity. So we have to create the trustful relationship, and building trustful relationship is help us to know what I need to do. Community have opportunity to know who I am, and I have opportunity to know what community I'm working, what their need, and we need to engage that community as much as we can in our decision making, in our research, in our profession, in our the client that we are working. We do indigenous ways of knowing that don't say client, they call relation. So we have to understand in relational perspective. Considering community based practice as a capacity building, the relative we are working, learning from the relative in our health science, physical science, in social science. We have to understand what are the communities, what they want, how they have been practicing. Last but not least important, the work we are doing, the research we are doing, the education we are doing. We have to transform our ways of doing, our ways of understanding in action, so that it can help us to reshape, help us to build relationship, and help us to create belonging, create responsibility, that work we are doing. Thank you so much again for this opportunity. I'm very grateful for your time that you are listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Datta. As you were presenting some of the content, it had me reflecting and just also thinking about my own positionality in terms of how I approach this work, and as settlers, what we need to do in order to help advance a lot of the calls to action. I'd like to also just mention that I am calling in from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and that Vancouver Coastal Health lies across these territories and other lands that I have not mentioned. So one of the questions that has come into the chat box for you, Professor Datta, is asking, how do you build understanding around historical truth between Indigenous populations and settlers? And there's also a follow-up question, but I'll save that and let you respond to this question. Thanks.
I as a settler, when color settler, when I came, I didn't have any opportunity. When I went to the settlement organization, I was learned what white did with the other white. I asked many questions about Indigenous people, culture, and history. I didn't have any opportunity to. So knowing this, what we need to do, or how we can build, we have to ask questions to the Indigenous elder and knowledge keeper in respectful way, because they are very helpful. They know how to guide us, and they can help us when we are asking respectfully what we can do together, how I can learn. An Indigenous elder knowledge keeper, they are the best one who can guide us what we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking about the fact that when I first began to work with elders and Indigenous knowledge keepers, that it really changed my worldview. And before that, reading about something in a book and watching a documentary is very different from interacting with people face to face and getting that knowledge and information firsthand. Oral storytelling, I think, is also really powerful when you can hear an elder and knowledge keeper sharing stories from their traditional lands. Another question that has come in the chat box is asking, it's about courage, and they're asking how much courage, I don't know whether or not you can measure courage, but how much courage does it take to stand in the truth? I think this is asking about, like, how do you, grapple with the fact that as settlers, sometimes a lot of our behaviors are complicit, and then how do we start to try to change our behaviors?
There are two ways of doing. If we need to think about the individual ways of doing or collective ways of doing. If we think about as an individual, what is my responsibility? Currently, I'm teaching the responsibility for decolonization, reconciliation as course. At the very beginning, it was very difficult. But when we started as an individual perspective, even the joining in this webinar, sharing each other perspectives is a starting point. Learning what we can do together. What is the meaning of TRC cooperation? How we can build relationship with my indigenous friend? Asking how I can learn, how I can be part of the solidarity, protecting my land, water, or indigenous land rights. This is also starting point. And not necessarily we have to do always all the time in the field. Even on learning, this is the starting point. Once we learn, we would learn more what we can do next. So first, I think educating ourselves from indigenous elder knowledge keeper or indigenous writing, building relationship with indigenous friend, asking those questions, whatever challenges we are facing to indigenous elders, knowledge keeper, sharing this knowledge, this perspective, the color settler or settler, challenging. This is first is understanding. Then we can create solidarity zone. And once we know, then we can act.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also thinking about the fact that when we don't have certain information, it's also taking some of that responsibility and searching for that information through different channels, whether that be going to your local library or finding different resources, indigenous resources on the internet. And when I think of the word responsibility, I was reading in a book, it talks about how you respond and also what you're able to do. So breaking up that word. And then thinking about the fact that as settlers, first we do need to sit with our discomfort, but then after we've sat with that discomfort, thinking about ways in which, as you were saying, how we can engage with indigenous knowledge keepers and elders to ensure that that burden isn't the work of reconciliation isn't just on indigenous populations, on indigenous knowledge keepers and elders, that we are equally responsible, if not more so, to really think about how we can change our ways of knowing and being. Another question that has come into the chat box is asking about what are the best locations and environments that can bring together newcomers from to Canada and Indigenous folks. So what are the best ways to promote this bridge building, or any potential resources that may already exist? If you could mention those, please.
The best ways always varies according to the person to person, community to communities. When I was trying to, since I came from, I came from the community that has been displaced, killed for their land rights, water rights. Before I came to Canada, I went for Norway, living in US, even living in Toronto. I didn't have opportunity to learning about indigenous people, how we can building this, how and why we need to build this between indigenous and non-indigenous. When I came to Saskatoon, I had opportunity to take course from indigenous educator. First course I remember that it was anti-racism theory and practice. Second course was cross-cultural research methodology. So those courses, learning about why understanding indigenous ways of knowing is important, it's helped me to understand my responsibility. So that's why I started the community garden from the knowledge in my background, so I have a responsibility to decolonize myself. And I have to start from my very small perspective. So when I'm learning, I didn't only learn myself. When I'm saying who I'm talking about my family. I'm teaching my learning to my future generation. We are learning together, and I'm also trying to share my knowledge with my own community, even though they don't have background. They don't. That's why they don't understand what I'm learning. So I think starting from the individual, learning why decolonization is important, and asking questions to the indigenous friends, network, elders, whenever I have opportunity. So this is the starting point. As challenging why it is like this, why it is happening to others, not with me. What kind of opportunity I'm getting that other people that don't get it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is really key to ask those challenging questions in terms of if you are a beneficiary of colonialism, to think about that, and again, to really challenge yourself. And that's important. Also, what you were saying, Professor Datta, in terms of making sure that you're seeking the knowledge of Indigenous knowledge keepers, and if it's appropriate to try to build those relationships. Yeah, it's really interesting when we think about social justice movements and activism work, how we can utilize technology to help ensure that the message is being spread to different populations and to people that may not have access to other means.
And one point I would like to add here, that last 10 years, even in my course, I introduced writing a reflection diary. So when we are talking, when we are learning, it's not just learning and it's gone. We are reflecting each time what we are learning, how we are learning. And going to the land is not enough. We have to learn what happened to the land, what was before colonization, and what is going on, what we should do. We have to reflect our learning in writing, so that after 5 years, when we are looking into it, we can see the decolonial journey that we have been doing. And my student, for me, it was very impactful for my keeping my own reflective journal. And my students, they love it, because in this journal, it's not limited with the academic writing. It's about the dreams, working for the dreams to create the new dreams. And it helped us to remind ourselves how we need to be responsible on what we are doing.
That's so important, I think, in terms of the work of unlearning and relearning. Keeping a journal and being able to refer back to the journal is such a useful tool. And what you're saying in terms of that writing, it doesn't necessarily always have to be academic. It really is about taking a critical look at oneself and seeing how we're growing and changing. I really appreciate that. I was also just wondering, when it comes to this work of decolonization, and you were talking about some of the different steps that are involved. Are there any other suggestions that you might make in terms of how we can continue this work of unlearning and relearning?
Yes, we can do various ways. For example, with attending a webinar on the similar topics, and also webinar from indigenous people is very helpful. And in the Facebook, we can follow the indigenous scholars and activists, what they are doing, what we can do. In the same time, we have to learn academically and practice in our education and the profession that we are doing. And we have to keep in mind that we are relative. Once we are relative, we are relationally responsible to each other. So, or the work we are doing, the way we are thinking, and this is the starting point of the decolonization. And it's not done by one webinar or one course or 1 year work. It's a lifelong journey. And it's a journey of the celebration, journey of learning, journey of empowerment.
Yeah, I think that is so important in terms of seeking out that information, again, as you're mentioning, from Indigenous scholars, researchers, and making sure that you're seeking out information from multiple different sources. And the fact that it is a lifelong journey, I think there are times when, as healthcare professionals, we are attending professional development webinars, and then it becomes a checkbox, and we want to really move away from that idea and have people question the way that they look at the world and think about how can they do some of this reflection when they're away from the office desk. So that is such a key point. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Datta. And I also am just curious if there's any other information or learnings that you want to share with us before we end our webinar today.
One point I would like to mention here, when you are thinking about health profession, according to Indigenous elder and knowledge keeper that I've been working, we have to remember that we need to consider the client as our relative. So once we are learning from the client, we shouldn't think about their only client or the participant of our research. Once we consider them as our relative, we become responsible or become part of our relative problem as my problem. So and we become careful, we become responsible, and it gave it's not much work, but it gave lots of opportunity to learn from the relative. So it's helped us to grow, it helped us to reshape, and it also gave me opportunity to building relationship. So end of that day, we are all relative, and we all have responsibility to our relationship.
That's such a beautiful message and a wonderful way to end this webinar in terms of thinking about the fact that we are all one, we are all related and connected. I would like to end on that high note, and again, just thank Professor Datta. Thank you so much for sharing some of your teachings, your knowledge, and your own unlearning and relearning journey. I'd also like to thank our interpreters once again, Lily and Jillian, for their wonderful work in terms of ASL interpretation. And finally, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Nisha, Tristan, and Nikki, for all of their support and technical efforts today. And thank you, Vancouver Coastal Health, for joining us today. We wish you a wonderful rest of your day, and thanks so much for joining in. Take care.
Thank you.